Listen, this past Friday night, I got a chance to go out with my family to see The Incredibles 2. Has anybody seen this yet? Like, it's brand new, just out. The Incredibles 2 have been 14 years since the original Incredibles came out, and so I got a chance to go out. It's a really good movie, but here's the thing. We have a whole bunch of Mr. Incredibles in here right now that put Mr. Incredible in the movie to shame. So dads, that's like the worst Dad's Day joke ever. That was like the true definition of dad joke. I promise we won't go there again, but dads that are here, thank you so much for being here. Happy Father's Day to all the dads that are here. I mentioned this on social media earlier. For those who have stepped into the role as a dad in the life of a child who didn't have a father, whose father wasn't there present, we thank you as well, and we recognize you this morning. As we get into this talk about dad's roles and Father's Day, and we're going to get all that, but I want to share a couple of things about next week before we get there. Because for the last couple of months, we've been talking about this project that we're involved in over in Auburndale with Habitat for Humanity. We've been able to be involved with a family's life, to see them move from, I remember there was a group of about 15 of us that showed up the first day to clear the land. It was kind of unexpected. They called us up and said, can you guys get out here? And we cleared the land. In the last 2 months, they've been building on that land. The home is near completion. Now, here's the thing. A while back, we had been building homes in Honduras. We said we want to start out doing some of that stuff here. And we did a lot of day of service projects. And we would get as many as 50 volunteers on a Saturday morning at Ridge Point Church to help out with day of service. And we said we want to kind of build that up a little bit. And this year we said we're going to start partnering with Habitat. And I know it's kind of intimidating. We're building home. It's a little bit different than just doing landscaping and all of that. We've had an incredible team there every Saturday and some weekdays for the last couple of months. The home is near completion. The dedication is next week. So this coming Saturday is the final Saturday that we're going to be working on that project. We need a bunch of help this Saturday. We're laying sod. We're doing landscaping. And the volunteer director I talked to yesterday said even young kids can come and be involved in the landscaping process. So if you're available next Saturday from 8 to noon, let us know that. Let us know that as we're going to be kind of completing that project. And the plan is by the end of next week to actually have the dedication. So if you want to be a part of that, I know that it's been intimidating. It's a big process. We've had an incredible team, some of which have been there most Saturdays over the last couple of months. So if you want to help out this coming Saturday, just let us know that. Fill out your connection card. Our director will get in contact with you, and we'll make sure that all that happens. The second thing happening next Sunday, and I'm really excited about this. I haven't talked about this at all really to anybody about this. But as we wrap up this series, there's a couple of special things we want to do to wrap up this series. Welcome to Worst. The series ends next Sunday morning. And something we've never done before, but I've asked my wife to share the stage with me. We're going to kind of talk about some things from a different perspective next Sunday. Now, if you know Beth, this is pushing her way outside of her comfort zone. But she said, yeah, absolutely, I'll do this. So be here next Sunday, something that she's never done before, we've never done before. But I'm excited to have Beth share the stage with me next Sunday. So really excited about that. I don't know how excited she is, but I'm excited about it. But listen, real quick, pop quiz. I want to begin with this. Pop quiz this morning. How many of you like rules? Okay, there's a few. How many say, no, I don't like rules at all? How many are like, I don't know, because I'm afraid of where this question's going? like I get that. They're like, wait a minute. And it is because I heard, sometimes teachers give you quizzes and they say there's no wrong question, no wrong answer to the question. I say, well, then why are you giving the quiz in the first place? I don't understand. But here's the thing. When it comes to rules, even though we have people that raise their hands for both sides of that question, when it comes to rules, I think a lot of times we're saying the same thing just from entirely different perspectives. Because most people would say, no, I don't like rules unless rules make sense to me or rules are required. For instance, if this Sunday morning we said, hey, instead of us meeting together in church like we are and everybody being in chairs, we're going to clear all the chairs out of this room and we're going to play a giant game. Some people would be really, really excited about that. Other people would be like, no, I'd rather just sit and I'll play the game. But if we said this coming Sunday, we're going to do this, and we clear all the chairs out, and everyone in both services gather together, and we bring in a couple of giant cylinders. We have 4 of those, actually, and then we have a couple of flags on either side of the auditorium. And then we bring in these 3 giant balls that are a little bit bigger than soccer balls or basketballs, or a little bit bigger, and we gather everyone together, and I say, okay, guys, here's the deal. Ready, set, go. Without any context of what we were doing. Now, if you were a middle school kid, you'd grab balls and start chucking them at each other. But for everyone else, we would be met with first bewilderment and then frustration. Because we would be sitting there saying, wait a minute, I want to know how to play the game. And in order for me to play the game, I have to have rules or expectations as to how the game goes. Are there teams? Are there other people that are on my team? And how do I know my teammates? What are the rules? How do we win? Like all of those things, if we don't have that sort of structure in our life, it gets really, really frustrating really, really quickly. So even for a person who says, I don't like rules, well, I don't like rules unless they make sense to me and they're required. It's why when we go to take a job, we want our expectations clarified. If I go in to take a new position, I'm not exactly sure what the expectations are for that position, I experience frustration really, really quickly because I don't know in my life if I can be successful at that job if my boss hasn't brought some clear expectations as to what is required of me. And here's the thing when it comes to that game. Even more frustrating than coming into a game where a bunch of us are together and we don't know the rules is coming into a game where it seems like everybody else knows the rules and I don't. See, maybe you were in middle school or high school and everyone had, maybe you transferred into a new school and everybody knew how to play a certain game. Maybe they played something like Ultimate Frisbee. And you watched it and you kind of observed from the outside and your thought process was something like this. Well, I can kind of observe and figure this thing out. But as I do, there's going to be a learning curve. They know the expectations and how the rules are played and all that stuff. And I know I'm going to mess up along the way, but I think I can wing it. I think I can figure it out. Well, that's fine when it comes to a game. But it's not practical when it comes to real life. Life just doesn't work that way. But for some of us, it feels like when it came to marriage, like everybody else must have had a book that they were given that they can understand how marriage works. But when it comes to me and to our marriage, I don't fully understand that. And that can be even more frustrating for the person who thinks everybody else has it figured out and I don't. If that's the boat that you're in, I want to guarantee you this morning, none of us have it fully figured out. We're all speaking different languages and we're trying to figure this thing out. However, there are some expectations that we can learn. There's some guidelines that we can put in place to say, I want to make sure that I'm getting this right, because for all of us, whether we said we like rules or not, if we had a rule that we don't understand, it doesn't make sense to us. It leads to, in our life, it leads to rebellion. But if I have expectations in my life that I can come to understand and appreciate, then it leads to, in my life, me valuing those expectations. Because now I say, God, not only do I have rules, but I kind of understand why these rules are in place. When I go to play a card game and there are certain rules that are in place and I figure it out, it makes more sense and it makes that thing more enjoyable. So when it comes to marriage, the problem is that a lot of us, we talked about this a little bit last week, there's no intentionality. We just kind of think that we're going to get by on looks and feelings. Well, when we started dating, they were really attractive to me and I felt really good. And I think that's going to be enough to sustain us through marriage. And then something happens. Our wedding day happens. And let me speak for a second from the guy's perspective. Because up until this point, for most of us as guys, we've not put a lot of energy and effort into figuring out how marriage is going to work. And so we're standing there in a room like this, full of our family and friends. And it's at this moment that we realize that up until this moment of my life, I just thought everything's going to be kind of simple. I love her and I feel good about her. And man, look how good she looks on her wedding day. But it's also at this point, this is the second scariest day in most men's lives. Because they're standing there and they're looking and they're saying, man, I just took on a whole lot of responsibility. And I don't know if I'm up to this task. The first scariest day is the day they hold their first child. Because at that point, we're like, where's the book on this? But up until then, we sit there at that moment where marriage starts to become real to us, and we think, man, I don't know, like, isn't there some sort of book I should have gone through? Isn't there some sort of class I should have taken? And maybe we've done both of those things, but still we sit there and say, I'm not sure that I'm up to this task. And so we said this last week that for those of us that are in marriage, we're going to have to go back to the structure, to the foundation of this whole thing, and say for a lot of us, we've built that foundation on some loose sand, and because of that, there's been some shifting, and now there's cracks in our building of our marriage. And the best thing we could do is go and destroy the foundation and start over. For others, the conversation isn't that difficult, but saying we have to repair some things. But it's going back and saying, man, I want to make sure that my marriage is built upon a solid foundation. And we've been talking through this the last couple of weeks, but each week we've been adding one thing to this equation as what are the biggest issues that we face in marriage? What are the biggest crises we face? First week we said this, unrealistic expectations. When it comes to marriage, the unrealistic expectations about what marriage is meant to be start to invade. We think when we're young, the wife thinks, man, my husband's always going to be there, and he's going to be the knight in shining armor. And they have this expectation as to what marriage is supposed to be about. It's a fairy tale expectation, but it's there. And for both sides, for the male and the female, they think if this is what marriage is supposed to be, and somewhere marriage kind of becomes this, well, then something must be broken in the relationship. And the easiest thing to do is to dissolve the relationship altogether. The problem in that case wasn't necessarily the marriage. There's been some things that could be fixed. But the problem was we had unrealistic expectations of what marriage was going to be. The second crisis we face is when there's unwillingness to grow within the marriage. When there's an unwillingness to grow, when we say, man, here's what I'm going to do. I'll be willing to contribute time to the relationship. I'm willing to have some discussions, and we'll have date night, all of those things. But I'm going to continue to be the person that I've always been. And that sounds really good. I even see people that give that advice. That say, hey, you can't change you. You keep being you. And the problem is if we keep being us, there's a chance that our marriage sails further and further away. The picture of marriage that we read in Scripture is not you be you. Because I'm broken, I'm fallen. I have to be on a continual life cycle in my life of being changed from the inside out. As I grow in my faith with who Jesus is, I grow more and more like Him. And if I'm growing more like Him and my spouse is growing more and more like Him, then inevitably through that we're growing closer and closer together. We have to have a willingness to grow in our relationship, otherwise it leads to the biggest crises in marriage. And number 3, we hinted on this last week, we'll talk about it more this week, is an unawareness of roles within the marriage. We don't know what the rules look like. We walk in and we thought we're going to get by on looks and feeling, and that's going to be enough to sustain us, and then we get there and say, wait a minute, how does this work? Now, I'm not talking about practical things. Part of the enjoyment of marriage is discovering those things. Figuring out what are her likes and dislikes, what are my likes and dislikes, and figuring out how those things work together. That's part of any marriage, and you figure that out in the first few years of marriage, hopefully. But I'm talking about a deeper level. When I come and say, God, I realize that I have a responsibility in this marriage, but what does that responsibility look like? There's 2 classic passages that we turn to that God says, listen, and it just makes sense. Like we're just singing about this whole idea that, God, I've seen you move mountains. When it comes to my relationship right now, I want to see you move. You've done it before. I believe you can do it again. But sometimes He does it by working through us. And He says to us, He says to me, JJ, I don't want you alone in the process. See, if you have a young couple that gets married and God were to say, hey, go get married and figure it out on their own, they wouldn't have a lot of chances for success. And so God says, I'm going to give you guidelines. I'm going to give you expectations so that you can have the best success in marriage possible. Not there still aren't going to be up and downs. They are because we're broken, fallen people, but because He says if we do things right, here's your best chance at success. Last week you looked at Genesis chapter 2 in the first classic passage. Today I want to turn to the second, Ephesians chapter 5. So if you have your Bibles, turn to Ephesians chapter 5. And we're going to talk about this for a little bit this morning. We have to kind of get through this fairly quickly. But as we talk about this, I want to make sure that we get this, because eventually we're going to turn this corner a little bit and start talking directly to the men who are here. It is Father's Day. We want to celebrate dads. But here's the thing I've seen in churches through the years, is sometimes we've been in danger of doing this, is that sometimes, and I want to challenge men, don't get me wrong, I want to make sure that we get that right. But sometimes we've done a disservice to men because we've lowered kind of the standard and expectation for men that are within the church and within our families. And we do things sometimes by tearing them down instead of lifting them up. We do things like when there's a struggle, when we're going through a husband and wife that have some sort of marital discord, right away the first thought for a lot of people is, okay, what do he do now? Like I've seen this over and over when I've seen family, friends that go through difficult times. And their friends start to hear, oh, so-and-so are having an issue in their marriage. The first thought in most people's minds is, what do you do this time? Or we walk into church, and I've seen churches do this before, and it's Mother's Day. We pull out the flowers, and everything's pretty, and everything's nice, and we talk about a message. A message on that Sunday morning is 21 reasons why we love our moms. And it's beautiful and flower, and we build moms up. And the Father's Day comes, and we say, here's 2 things it takes for you to be a man. As if they're not men, and if their attention span can only bring 2 points. like that's it. But that's what happens is sometimes we have a tendency to look down on men in culture and in life and to lower the expectation, and this has been going on for a while. It's been going on for a while because the Bible speaks, the Apostle Paul speaks, and he says that when I was a child, I grew like a child, I ate like a child, but as I got older, I started to think more like an adult. And there was this period of growing from childhood to adulthood. And for a lot of men in our culture, we've allowed them to settle into adolescence permanently. And I'm not saying that we can't have hobbies, we should. But for some of us as men, we've allowed our hobbies to rule our lives. And whatever the hobby is, it could be anything from playing video games to climbing mountains. It could be anything from building homes to playing sports, to whatever that is that we're doing. We have our hobbies, and hobbies are good for us to have this escape and to get away, but sometimes we become so focused on those things that those things start to dominate our lives. And men don't accept the responsibility that it takes to, man, this is what it looks like for my marriage to have success. I play a very significant role. And so God says in Ephesians chapter 5, he says, I want to get into what it looks like. And as we talk about this topic, it's a tender topic. We're going to actually read through this whole passage pretty quickly this morning. We don't have a lot of time to break down every verse. We're going to look at a couple of significant verses. But Paul had this teaching to the church that's in Ephesus, and he's teaching on here's how, as Christians, we should walk and live and function. And then he's about to transition into the role of the family. And there's this verse in between those 2 sections that says this: submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. He says if you want your family to function well, here's what it looks like. You submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Now later on, we're going to get into a specific verse where it talks about wives submitting to your husbands, and that's where things get very delicate. But prior to that, it says this: submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. That means when I come into the marriage relationship, and when I come into the family relationship, the family dynamic, literally the verse there for submit is talking about that we're not in it just for our own good. But that when it comes to the family, whether it's wives or husbands, whether it's children or parents, for our family to function as it should, there's this overarching verse that says you choose love. You don't choose to serve yourself, you choose to serve the better good, you choose to serve the other person. And that by doing that, you submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And here's the picture Jesus gives. Jesus says, I want to show the example, because sometimes these verses have been taken out of context. And men through the years have used some of these verses for oppression, and others have used it for rebellion. And he says, I want to teach you what submission is really, really about. It's about choosing to purpose the good of the other individual in the relationship. That I want to choose to love the other person. And submission is embraced where trust is established. So Jesus says, let me give the picture of what relationship looks like. Because when Jesus came here to earth, it wasn't that he was any less important than the Father, but he says, I'm going to submit to the will of the Father. He prayed in the garden, God, I don't want this I'd love for this cup to pass. Nevertheless, Father, not my will, but your will be done. By doing that, he wasn't saying he was any less important. But he says, I'm willing to submit to the plan of the Father because where submission is embraced, where trust is established. And so it begins in this relationship where it says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And Jesus did two things. He showed us what submission looks like when he submits to the will of the Father. But then he also says within the confines of these verses, but also in the picture, I'm going to give you the picture of what it means to submit to something, because the next couple of verses talk about the marriage relationship and how Christ is the head of the church, as the husband is supposed to be head of the wife and the family. So let's get into that because we don't have a lot of time to look at this. But so we have this verse that says, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. And then we get into wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body is himself its Savior. Now as the church submits to Christ, also wives should submit to in everything to their husbands. Now we read that, and especially in the context of modern society, that looks really disheartening. It's because we've misunderstood what that verse is really meant to be about. It does establish that there's roles within relationships. But sometimes we've used that to say, well, is one person more important than the other? And last week we said unequivocally that's not the case. Men have used this verse in the past to say, well, that means we're more spiritual or that we're better leaders, and that's not at all the truth. A lot of times in a lot of relationships, the woman is the more spiritual one, and she's the better leader, and that's fine. We're equal. We have different roles, but we're equal within those roles. But then we make this transition because we want to get to the idea where submission is embraced only where trust is established. And so we get to the wife's role, but then we get to the husband's role. And it says this: husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Jesus says, okay, husbands, you want to figure this out. Dads, you want to figure out what it looks like to be the leader in this relationship. Love your wife as Christ loved the church. That doesn't mean you can't have a good time. You can and you should. But it's saying that, listen, within the confines of this life, and as I'm having a good time, there's also this supreme role that I have, this really important role that I have to make sure that I lead my family well. Because the influence that we have as husbands and as fathers is almost immeasurable. There's so many things that have just because of the role that we play, because of what God puts on us. And we have to really, really get this. Men are supposed to be producers, not consumers. Men are supposed to be creators and cultivators. And men are called within their family to lead their families well. I want us to get this. There's an incredible leadership principle that's true of all leadership. I think it applies within the family. This is true of all leadership. There's an incredible pastor up in Atlanta. His name's Andy Stanley. Many of you know who Andy Stanley is. But Andy Stanley said this. He said, leaders don't make decisions on their own, but they own decisions once they're made. I want us to get that again. Leaders don't make the decisions on their own, but they own decisions once they're made. And what that means is that when it comes to major life decisions that we make as a family, and we'll probably talk about this a little bit next week, but when it comes to major life decisions, I don't begin to think that I'm the most spiritual, the smartest, or the best leader in my family. Now I'm responsible. I have a responsibility. I have a role to play. But when we sit down, I don't make a decision on my own and say, this is it, my way or the highway. That's not how we're supposed to lead. So I involve the family. As it talks about, I involve my wife. We make a decision. And sometimes I say to her, you have much more wisdom about this than I do. And so I might not have chosen to do it that way, but you're right about that, so we're going to go and do that way. And here's the important part of that. The second part where it says I own the decision once it's made. Here's what I cannot do, because this is destructive to marriages. It's when we have a disagreement, and then we choose to do it the way the way our spouse wants us to do it. And we say, well, I would have done it that way, but since you think you got it made, you think you got it figured out, we'll do it your way. And then we're just sitting there hoping it fails. And then when it fails, we say, see, I told you so. Don't raise your hand, but has anybody ever done that before? Man, like we do that, and what happens is we give away our responsibility. I'm not saying I always have the right decision. I don't. I don't always have the right answer. But if I look into a situation and I say to my wife, I say, Beth, I think I would have done it that way, but I think you might be right. And we're going to choose to do it your way. At that moment, I own the decision. It becomes my decision. Leaders don't make decisions on their own. I don't want your decision to fail because it affects our family. So now it becomes my decision. But they own the decision once it's made. Now here's the thing. As we talk about this role, and I know this is one of those controversial topics, and we've walked delicately through this landmine that are these verses, and I've read a lot on this. A lot of different commentators believe a lot of different things about this passage. But we cannot get away from the role that husbands and dads play. In fact, I saw a study done, and this was just remarkable information. I don't really share a lot of information about studies and whatnot. But I saw this, and this was actually a study that was done almost 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago. I haven't seen it replicated. I'd love to see if the statistics changed today. But it's a very detailed subject about one thing, about the role the dad plays and their children being involved in spiritual life and growth later on in their life. And I want to see this because these are incredible statistics. In 5 different categories, we're looking at parent involvement in church, leading to when their children become adults, how much of them attend regularly, and in some cases, how many of them attend irregularly. So the statistics look like this. When mom and dad are regular going to church, when mom and dad are together in church, the statistic says this: 33% of children, when mom and dad are both going to church, 33% of the children will grow up regularly attending church, and 41% of them will attend irregularly. So if mom and dad go to church, there's 74% of children that after that continue to go to church, most of them irregular, a lot of them regular. But if mom and dad are together in this, 33% attend regularly. Remember that number. If mom and dad go to church together, 33% attend regularly. If mom is regular, but dad is kind of sporadic in his church attendance, watch this number, 3% of children attend church. Compared to 59%. So still, there's still, if mom is going to church, moms, if that's you, I want to encourage you, because if you're going to church, still 62% of your children, on average, are going to be going to church on some level later on in life. If the mom goes regular to church and the dad never goes to church, the number is 2% and 37%. For the first time, we dip below 50% of children stop going to church entirely. If dad doesn't go to church at all, 50%, more than 50% of children don't go to church at all as they become adults. Here's where the numbers just shocked me. For the last 2 categories, we only have the number of children that attend church regularly. We don't have the irregular numbers. But when we began, we said if mom and dad are regular, 33% of the children say we're going to stay faithful as they grow up. If only the dad goes to church regularly and mom is irregular, that number actually goes up. If dad goes to church regularly and mom isn't, the number goes up. And even more shocking, if the mom never goes, the number goes up even higher, 44%. So I look at that and say, here's the deal. We have a responsibility, and these numbers, they don't lie. Again, the numbers are a little bit old. I'd love to see this particular study replicated. But we have a function as husbands and as dads. When we talk about this idea that the husband is responsible for, and the dad is responsible for the spiritual well-being of his family, it isn't just something that the Bible is dictating to us, a rule that doesn't make sense. But it's something that when we see it in the context of here's what it actually has the effect on the children. I saw this when I was my first year of youth ministry. I had this incredible kid in our youth group. And man, he was just dynamic. And I was kind of the new youth pastor. I was trying to build up relationships. And I found out he was in 7th grade. He was a golfer. He played for the golf team at his school. And I was trying to learn golf. I thought, hey, man, let's go play some golf. And really, really good kid. And I started to notice that his mom came to church every Sunday. Man, she was there every Sunday. And the dad would only come on Easter, Christmas, big holiday events like that. And eventually, over the course of the next couple of months, I saw his attendance become less and less. Even though he loved what we were doing and he wanted to be active in the youth group, ultimately he was following his dad's lead. We have responsibility, which is why we finish out these verses, reading verses 28 to 33, and it says this. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. And then ironically, he goes back to the passage we read last week out of Genesis chapter 2. It is therefore a man shall leave his father and mother, hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. He said, this mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. God says, listen, I know that you think that when you enter into marriage, it's just going to be an organic, you have it figured out. That you don't have to put any work in, that it's just magically going to happen, that you're going to get by on love and feelings and looks. And then when those things don't last, we have to go back and say, wait a minute. Maybe part of the problem is that I've never tried to be the person God created me to be. The marriage just isn't about finding the right person, it's about being the right person. That I want to go back and say, God, what are the expectations that you have on me as a husband or as a wife? What are the things that I'm supposed to be doing? Who are you trying to cultivate in my life for me to be? Now let me start to fulfill that function. Let me start to fulfill that responsibility, and let me see how this starts to affect the way that we begin to relate to each other. Let's pray together. Father, first of all, we thank you for the example that you set for us. God, you sent Jesus into this world to be both the picture of submission, that he comes in and he says that where we start to submit, we submit because love has been just pictured and brought into the relationship. And that God, Jesus was willing to embrace that submission because he trusted you. And so, God, I pray for us right now that as you give this beautiful picture of what relationship's supposed to look like, that there's harmony within that relationship. God, I pray right now for marriages that are struggling, that in this moment right now that you'd bring about restoration. I pray for families that are in the process of being destroyed. God, I know that as we see the issues that our world is facing today, that so many of the issues that we face are tied back to conflict within the family. God, I pray for those issues that we're dealing with, for families that seems like, man, their family is on the verge of just utterly being destroyed. God, that you would make a way where there seems to be no way. And that, God, we would begin to live within the function, within the role that you have for us. Not a bunch of rules that we can't understand, but that, God, you start to give us guidelines that once we start to understand them, we embrace those guidelines. And say, man, I want to be the best that I could be in the role that you've given me. And go out, God, whether that means right now that my function is as a single adult living within this world, God, I want to be the best single adult that I can be. Whether that's me in a premarital stage, getting ready for marriage, God, I want to be the best. I want to live this stage of my life as best I can. For those that are past marriage, that are post-marriage, that they can use this season of their life to begin to speak truth into the younger generation and to live the best that they can be. God, today for husbands, for wives, that we would fulfill our roles, that we would be exactly who you've called us to be, to function within those relationships as best we can. God, ultimately that only happens through Jesus, because as Jesus enters into our life, he makes our lives better, but he also makes us better at life. He makes us better husbands. He makes us better dads. He makes us better wives. He makes us better moms. And so, God, for the person this morning that doesn't know Jesus, Jesus wants to enter into their life right now to make their life better, to give them hope and eternity, but also to make them better at life. And so, God, I pray above everything else this morning, in the midst of our prayers for marriages to be restored and for lives to be changed, God, I pray for the person who doesn't know you above everything else, that today would be the day they say, I choose Jesus. Because ultimately that's why we exist. It's in his name we pray. Amen.